What do you think, first of all, about this protest going ahead? I mean, there were something like 1,000 police who were on duty, and the rally against the Al-Quds March, which of course is basically in support of the Iranian regime. That was on the other side of the river, but they all separated. Major policing operation, although the actual march was banned, it had to be a static rally. Looked at actually not as many people turned up as perhaps anyone was expecting. But the fact that we've got people like Bobby Vylan shouting death, death to the IDF, and apparently the police don't really think that that's a matter for them.
Well, who would have heard of Bobby Vylan if he hadn't have done these?
Exactly.
That's a simple thing. He's getting himself famous by doing this kind of behaviour, and he knows that. I mean, what I would say is that the police are effectively in the hands of the prosecutors. Back in the 80s, the police would take their own prosecutions and would live or die by that. Nowadays, the CPS tell them what is an offence and what isn't an offence and what passes muster to go before a court. And they are hamstrung by that. There's no doubt about it. But I would say as well, Mark Francois was talking about legislation. His government has been in were the legislators for 14 years. It should be laws that allow the police to deal with this kind of behaviour. Yeah. It's this hasn't just happened.
But it's very difficult, isn't it? Because he's talking about another country's army. He feels strongly against it. Again, if I sat down with Bobby Vylan, he was actually able to have a sensible conversation with him about some actual facts, and actually let's go with some proof and some facts. I mean, his argument is rather undermined. He'll be, this is an army that's committed genocide. I mean, just complete, utter, made-up, stupid TikTok nonsense, spouted, yes, by the United Nations, but absolutely verifiably untrue. But if you genuinely believe that, which he probably does, I don't know, he may just be doing the whole thing for effect, a lot of them do that, then you would think that army should be killed, in which case, is that an unreasonable thing? He's not saying kill this person here who's a conscript to the IDF. He's saying kill the IDF, an overseas army. Should that be illegal, or should that be part of someone's freedom of speech?
Well, and this is what the legislators need to make a decision on. And clearly, at the moment, it is free speech. What I would say is the government have also failed to prescribe the Iranian militia.
Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yes. I mean, they've not been prescribed. Well, America has, other countries have, and I know there are issues with it in that they are part of the state infrastructure effectively. But for goodness sake, we've seen what they've been up to in Iran. We've got so many Iranian people over here that have got links to families that have told us what they get up to. We've seen it on the videos. We should be prescribing them.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, this failure to act. I mean, we're going to be talking to a guest a little bit later in the show at midday, Matt Goodwin, who's talking about this broken Britain and this suicidal empathy from our political classes, I would say from academia, the police, the media as well. This sort of suicidal empathy, this sort of, well, we must understand that different people feel different ways. Like, that must make policing very difficult when you haven't got a society which largely shares the same, not necessarily same views, but the same values about right and wrong and what should be legal and what should not be legal. How difficult a tightrope is that to walk if you're in counter-terrorism?
Well, it's an incredibly difficult tightrope, as you say, and made worse by, if you go back to the West Midlands Chief Constable and his behaviour, how do the officers on the street have to react when their own chief constable is caught effectively sidling up to the very people that are causing the problems? And I think in society, we do need to get a grip. We need some strong leadership. We need to say where our country's going and what we will and won't accept, and make the legislation there for the police to enact. And this politicisation of policing has just made things so much worse.
And that's incredibly dangerous, isn't it? We've seen it, it was happening long before the Southport riots, but certainly ever since those in the summer of 2024, we see this play out. And that's where a lot of people, I don't understand, and what Lucy Connolly wrote was a horrible, horrible tweet. And, I don't condone what she wrote at all. But how Lucy Connolly's tweet could merit her being arrested, not allowed bail, and she pleaded guilty because, again, she believed that she wasn't going to get a trial before the date when she would likely get out if she pleaded guilty. She wanted to get back to her daughter. A lot of us would have done the same. But she went to prison for over a year And yet someone like Bobby Vylan, Deputy FD IDF, Kneecap, the other band who urging people on camera to kill your local Tory MP, apparently not in any way incitement to violence. And I would have thought that was so blatant and so obvious. I find it extraordinary that anyone could even query that is a crime.
And I'm with you 100% on that. What I would say, I think what we have found is when societies are about to start rioting or are rioting, then strong action very early through the courts does often prevent the situation escalating and getting out of control. So I've got some time for that. The riots, if you remember, 2011, I think it was, were dealt very swiftly and quickly by the courts, which pretty much stemmed rioting from there on. So I've got
but that's for people who were rioting.
Yes, exactly.
Somebody was there are people who threw bricks at the police who served less time than some people who wrote tweets.
She was a scapegoat. There's no doubt about that, and she was punished, by and I'm sure there was some political pressure put to give her that kind of sentence. So there's no doubt about that. But as a country, we've got to start working out what we actually believe and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And the behaviour of this lot on over the weekend just isn't. And we need to make the legislation to enforce that.
So Ed Miliband very much in the news. He did the media round at the weekend, whittering on, telling everyone he was going to be very, very clear and absolutely doubling down, trebling, quadrupling down on his long-standing mantra, which is, if only we hadn't spent so long to get to actually having on more renewables, more solar power, more wind power and the like, then we wouldn't actually be hit by things like the Strait of Hormuz closing and the shortages of oil, and we wouldn't be beholden to petrostates or dictators like Putin or like Iran, and we would be absolutely fine. We wouldn't face all these increases in prices. Is he right?
No, he's not. As you say, in Ed Miliband's fantasy world, all his wind and solar farms are helping to make us less dependent on fossil fuel dictators, as he likes to call them. But wind and solar between them account for 5% of total energy demand in Britain. There's virtually no possibility that in any time foreseeable future it's going to go anywhere near 100%. Therefore, if you want an energy security policy, okay, fine, let's have a bit of homegrown wind and solar as part of the energy mix. But you wouldn't stop there. You would want to say, well, how can we secure our fossil fuel supplies by resuming drilling in the North Sea? Last year was the first year since the 1960s no exploratory wells were dug in the North Sea. We would be fracking. We would also be keeping a coal reserve. I mean, coal is a filthy fuel, not necessarily what you want to burn too much of in good times, but it is also very easy to store. Do you remember, people of our age, Julia, will remember how the Thatcher government managed to keep the lights on for 11 months during the miners' strike in 1984 and 85. And that was because they had the foresight to stockpile coal at all the power stations beforehand. Now, we don't have that facility to do that now because all coal has been removed entirely from the grid. Gas is very much more difficult to store.
And what storage facility we did have has been closed down?
Yes, well, the rough oil storage facility, which is basically a used gas cavern in the North Sea, can be used for storing gas now. It was closed down in 2017 under Theresa May's government. It was actually reopened during the Ukraine crisis, but we have pathetically small gas storage facilities in this country. So,
but this is the thing that's extraordinary, is that, when you give that stat, and we were talking to Liam Halligan earlier, who's also a big critic of net zero policy, when you actually look at the total energy mix, and on a normal day, even if the sun is shining, you are looking at only 5% of our total energy needs being provided by renewables. I don't think that most of the people making policy, and I'm going to include the Energy Secretary, or the sending us back to the dark ages, one wind turbine at a time, Secretary Ed Miliband, among those. Every time I've questioned MPs who are supportive of net zero, and I've asked them just vague questions, just like, So what percentage of our energy needs can be used, dealt with by renewables? They'll say, I don't get into the detail. No. I mean, I always say, to the nearest 10%. And I've said, do you know what? I'll take it to the nearest 30%. Give me any number that you think. We've got MPs making decisions on this stuff. They've voted in the House of Commons. They're making policy. And they haven't got a clue what they're talking about, that we are utterly reliant on fossil fuels for decades to come. And anyone who knows anything about energy knows that.
Yes, they do. And there's another big porky Ed Miliband keeps telling us, by the way. He keeps saying that, it make no difference if we drill for gas in the North Sea because it'll just be sold on international markets, won't reduce the price in Britain by a penny. It's absolute poppycock. You can talk about a global oil price, but not gas, because gas is so much more difficult to transport and store. The wholesale prices vary enormously around the world. They're 3 times as much in Europe as they are in the US. And why? Because the US is producing more gas locally, while we are relying increasingly on liquefied natural gas being imported from the US, Qatar, and so on. And if we were producing more gas in the North Sea, it would have an downwards impact on prices.
But it also
if we were
gives
fracking, it would be even more so.
It gives us control. And I know things like different oil and different gas, and there'll be stuff that, even America is a massive net exporter. They still have to import some of their oil because it's different kinds of oil and different kinds of gas. But the crucial thing is when there is a massive shortage, and we saw this during, lockdown, didn't we? When we suddenly, had shortages of things like medicines and the like, with the craziness that went on there. You know what? Nations look after their own. And when you've got your energy supply, well, you don't allow it to go on the world market. You keep it for yourself to keep your lights on. And we would be in position to do that. And we can't do that because we don't have enough of it. Some of our European neighbours, though, like France with their reliance on nuclear energy, they have done very well. Germany, didn't they? They've actually sort of knocked down wind farms to get to the coal underneath because they're so desperate for energy in recent years.
Yes, and Germany, of course, they also closed 3 of their nuclear power stations while Putin was amassing his forces on the Ukrainian border, when you could see what was going to happen. And they actually took out 3 nuclear power stations. The remaining 3 they subsequently
genuinely
closed.
Scary.
We're not the only European country with a poor energy policy by any means, but you just hit on something there that, in times of extreme crisis, a country which produces its own fossil fuels can limit exports. And this is a big fear, which I don't think anybody has really latched onto properly yet, is that if this war goes on and global oil prices surge, Donald Trump could act to protect US consumers by limiting the exports of US oil and gas. And US is the world's biggest oil producer. We import about a quarter of our gas imports now come from the US. We will be in very, very serious trouble if the Donald Trump administration were to take that
and it's the sort of thing that would not be out of the realms of
not
possibility.
Out of character at all, I'm afraid.
What do you make? Ed Miliband's eco crusade has been dubbed a monumental act of political self-harm, because he's rejected calls to say, okay, given where we are now, see the crisis, right, we're going to, we should return to expanding North Sea oil production. And because again, they did actually backtrack on their previous Labour policy, basically closing down effectively North Sea oil and gas to allow continuing oil and gas, but no new exploration, as you pointed out. But do you think there's any chance that he'll be overridden by Keir Starmer, who I don't think is an eco-zealot like Ed Miliband, and who may be forced by circumstances to accept that this is a national act of self-harm?
I think Keir Starmer could well be a little more pragmatic on this, but the trouble is the bulk of Labour MPs. Ed Miliband's one of the most popular members of the cabinet among Labour MPs, which is
Labour
really
Party
quite
members.
frightening. And Labour Party members, if Keir Starmer were to fall on his sword, we could well end up with Ed Miliband as Prime Minister, which doesn't really bear thinking about it. If it was just an act of political self-harm, by the way, I wouldn't be too bothered, to damage the Labour Party. But it's an act of national economic self-harm, and that's what matters far more.
And of course, the economic self-harm is also harms our ability to defend ourselves and our interest, does it not? Because again, you can't make anything. You certainly can't make steel or concrete without fossil fuels. You simply cannot keep the lights on, and you can't deliver AI on any grand scale, by the way, without cheap and plentiful energy. And that's going to be the future of not just the economy, but also the future of defence as well. This is an absolute disaster for us.
Yes, it is. And going back to defence, our defence armed forces have been humiliated in the past couple of weeks. We've had sovereign British territory in Cyprus attacked. We haven't been able to defend it or respond to it. We don't even have any warships. Do you know what? The armed forces have a net zero commitment. The Royal Air Force, bizarrely, has a target of reaching net zero by, I think it's 2040. And the idea that we should be spending money and time and effort on trying to decarbonise the armed forces at a time we, desperately need them to defend the country is
These people
outrageous.
are insane. They are a danger to us and our country. We need to get to grips with this. Let's just start, first of all. The Prime Minister has set out a load of help, 53 million quid for people who have heating, or largely in rural areas, lots in Northern Ireland. There's lots of talk about, will we need to have a bailout for energy for everybody, millions across the country. We had that multi-tens of billion-pound bailout under Liz Truss as a result of the energy spike under Ukraine. Do you think that A, we will actually get to that point because of what's happening in Iran, and B, will there be a bailout? Can we afford it?
In terms of if we need one, it all depends on that that little piece of 20-mile wide water that very few people had heard of before this conflict, the Strait of Hormuz, the pinch point of the global economy, in and out of the Persian Gulf. If that stays closed, Julia, for 3 or 4 weeks, then we are going to see oil going up above 150, maybe towards $200 a barrel. And that's when things get very, very difficult for a big energy importer like the UK, as we now are. So a lot of it depends on events in the Middle East. If the Strait is cleared quite quickly, then a lot of this pressure will go away. The global economy is actually quite sluggish, so that means the energy prices will come down. But if there's a massive supply restriction through that strait, then we will have problems. And the UK is vulnerable because we are such a heavy now energy importer, because successive governments, and I agree with your comments on not giving the previous government a free pass on this, successive governments have throttled our ability to generate our own energy resources from the North Sea with a combination of very high, almost suicidally high taxation on that energy extraction and virtue signaling net zero policies. So whether or not there's a bailout will depend at the moment on what happens in those Strait of Hormuz. And that's why so many people are focused on that.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? We've got ourselves in this position. Are we, not uniquely necessarily, but perhaps at the worst end in terms of our exposure to the issue of these oil shortages? If 20% of the world's oil supply simply can't get out of that strait, are we particularly at risk more than other countries? We know, America is a massive net exporter of oil and gas, and so they're much more protected than we are. But compared to our European cousins, are we in a worse or a better predicament than them?
Right, America's largely sitting pretty because it had its shale revolution. It went from being the world's biggest energy importer just in 2004-5, and then the shale revolution happened. If viewers and listeners have watched Landman, the Permian Basin, the Dakota American oil fields, but Trump's still vulnerable because if petrol prices, what Americans call gas prices, go up, then voters are going to get really upset in the US ahead of the congressional midterms. I don't wish to be alarmist, Julia, I love this country, as do you, but I do think the UK is uniquely vulnerable, even among our European partners, even though we have that incredible resource, which is the North Sea. It's complete madness. Why? Because we have no gas storage. We have capacity to store 7 or 8 days of gas. And it's absolute nonsense, I hear. If we generate our own gas from the North Sea, it will be sold to the highest bidder. It's just complete nonsense because of the way the small number of pipelines that leave the UK. It will make us much more secure, and we'll get a lot more tax revenue, and there'll be a lot more jobs if we pump our own oil and gas particularly from the North Sea, and if we had somewhere to store it. Now, there's a massive undersea cave off the coast of Yorkshire called Rough, and it's owned by Centrica. And successive governments have been rowing with Centrica, the old British Gas, about who should be maintaining and paying for that gas storage facility. There's been rows about it for years, Whitehall stasis and torpor. And now we've been caught, paddy pants down because we have very little stored gas. We have big energy importing requirements. The way our net zero electricity market is rigged means that a high price of gas then ripples across for what we pay for renewable energy too. So it's a combination of successive policies on tax and particularly net zero policy.
Well, let's talk about the net zero, because Ed Miliband said again and again, every time he goes out and because he's going to be really clear, let's be really clear, he says, and he keeps talking about how, it's why, because of what happens, things like, the Strait of Hormuz, because of energy price hikes like Ukraine and what happened with Vladimir Putin, that is why, he says, we should be building up on our net zero capability, relying more on clean renewables, because that would mean we are not at the beck and call, we're not beholden to, the tyrants and the petrostates. That's his argument. If we spend more on renewables, we focus on that, we will be more energy self-sufficient. Is he right?
Well, look, Ed Miliband constantly confuses, I think deliberately, electricity generation from overall energy use. Let's be really clear about it. Viewers and listeners are not thick. They're often practical people that run their own businesses, that live in the real world. Yep. About 40 to 50% of our electricity generation is renewables on average, but that's just a third of the energy we use is electricity. Oil and gas is still 60 to 70% of our primary energy use in this country. Look, half the trains in the country aren't electric, they're diesel, right? Most cars on the road are petrol and diesel still, and that's not going to change for a very long time.
I'm not changing mine.
So it's just, and you're not alone, Julia, by any means. It's just crazy to get rid of our ability to pump our own oil and gas before we have viable alternatives. And in a lot of cases, the engineering capacity, the science just isn't there. The battery storage just isn't there. I mean, Ed Miliband wants to, virtue signal like crazy to the gung-ho pro-environment Labour backbenchers and the even more gung-ho, even more economically illiterate Labour activists across the country. But it's just not going to work. And let's just talk about politics for a second, because we are now seeing on the right of politics, the centre-right of politics, even with the Tories, a real sense that these net zero policies have to change. Yeah. Now, Mel Stride said to me in an interview last week on When the Facts Change that the Tories' North Sea policies, under Cameron and Osborne, were, quotes, utter madness. And they were.
That's hopeful.
It is hopeful. Yeah, for years, the Tory party, after, from Theresa May's "We Are the Nasty" speech onwards, they came up with some absolutely insane hugger-hoodie policies, and net zero was part of that. What Theresa May did was part of that. But the Overton window now is shifting rapidly. Reality is looming. The rubber is hitting the road. And what this conflict with Iran has done, it's exposed the fragile nature of our energy complex and our massive over-reliance, not just on imported oil and gas, but imported electricity too.
Yeah, I mean, it is genuinely, I'm genuinely terrified. I'm not joking. I'm actually terrified that there are people who are in charge of these policies who don't seem to know, as you say, some basic facts. And if they do know the basic facts, they couldn't possibly support the policies that they are pushing on us. In terms of bailouts and the like, I mean, we know there is no money. And you've been a political commentator as well as an economist for many years. There is no money. We know that. We've got an announcement from the Work and Pensions Secretary, Pat McFadden, today, about a little bit of a bailout for employers to try and get under 25-year-olds who've been on universal credit for 6 months or more back into work. So they're going to get £3,000 to take those people on. Ironically, about the same amount of money as the extra national insurance cost that was put up by the government a year or so ago, making it much harder and much less likely for employers to hire inexperienced, unemployed under 25-year-olds. I mean, literally giving with one hand, taking with the other, giving it back. I mean, this is just the most ridiculous sort of circular way of just messing around with the economy. Do you think we have any hope of getting our economy back in good order when this government is obviously quite intent on not tackling the massive big elephant in the room at all times, which is not net zero, we talk about that all the time now, but welfare?
Yeah, welfare is the welfare state is like a beached whale. It's like the sort of Death Star in Star Wars, sucking all energy out of the economy. We are a very highly taxed economy these days. And, small and medium-sized companies in particular who give youngsters a step on the career ladder, they've been absolutely walloped for many years, but particularly under Labour with these new increases in employer national insurance, with ridiculous, massive double-digit percentage increases in the minimum wage, particularly for young people. That's why suddenly, we've got youth unemployment higher than Greece and Italy.
Yeah.
I mean, for decades, those Club Med countries, if you like, they've been the ones with very high youth unemployment. But now we've got that at the worst possible moment for the economy. Youngsters can't get a start. As AI is coming in, youngsters can't get a start. And it's such a sort of socialist left-wing thing to do, to tax companies out of existence and then subsidize the remaining companies in order to take young people on. Why doesn't the government just get out of the way?
Yes.
Spend less, spend it better, focus on what the state can do well, which is looking after the genuinely vulnerable. Everybody wants that to happen. Focus on what the state can do well, which is, getting money together in order to provide basic health and education services, rather than all these fancy pants schemes, giving money here, taking it away there, making clients out of voters, making state...
Putting everyone on the payroll, that's part of it. But also, again, people in entire cabinet with no business experience, telling businesses how to make their business decisions. The Metropolitan Police Chief is going to head to Washington this week to try and seek help over getting the unredacted versions of the Epstein files. We still haven't seen all of them, but revelation after revelation after revelation. The latest, this photograph of Jeffrey Epstein, always fully dressed himself, interestingly, but with Mandelson, Peter Mandelson and Andrew, the former prince, both in their sort of white bathrobes, sitting at the same table with him. The first picture I think we've had of all three of them together. More and more documents keep emerging. How damaging is all of this?
Well, it is damaging, but it is more damaging to the particular people concerned. I think the monarchy has done what it can do. King Charles has stripped Andrew. There's not a lot more he can do because it's now under an ongoing police investigation. So we have to leave it at that. But, with Mark Rowley going across to the States, getting information out of America could take years. They seem to be reluctant in releasing a large quantity of papers, I think 2.5 million of them, because it obviously involves a lot of American big names. We've highlighted the two in this country. A comedian on the Oscars, presenting the Oscars, highlighted the two. You forgot to mention the grooming gangs, which raised a lot of anger on social media.
Well, he made a joke about, at least we won about the Brits. They didn't have any British actors or actresses nominated for Oscars, but he said at least they arrest their paedophiles, he said.
Yeah, he did. But, you've got to take the broader picture because there've been grooming gangs operating in the UK for donkey's years with the police, social security and the government completely turning a blind eye to it. So, he's only touching the tip of the surface there.
Indeed.
But as far as the police getting information, as I said a moment ago, this could take years. It could be dragged on and on and on. We could be talking about this in 2030.
I wouldn't be surprised. We know how long cases take to come to court. I must stress, of course, both Andrew and Mandelson, neither of them has been charged, and neither of them have actually, they both deny any wrongdoing. But it is interesting Isn't it? Just how much this story is still dominating, but also the fact that it's only 3 Brits who've either been arrested and charged and convicted in case of Ghislaine Maxwell as basically working with Jeffrey Epstein to abuse these girls, and the former Prince Andrew and our former ambassador to Washington. They're the only people who've actually been faced any criminal investigation, whereas in America, so many big names have been mentioned. Again, being mentioned in the Epstein files doesn't mean any wrongdoing necessarily. Travelling on his plane doesn't necessarily mean any wrongdoing, so we must be clear about that. But it does seem bizarre that our incredibly slow and cranky criminal justice system appears to be moving at a faster pace than the Americans.
Well, it is moving at a faster pace because we're probably a bit more open about it, given the sort of trouble that the justice system here has been in the past. The American justice system is working very slowly in terms of releasing papers relating to Americans' involvement. And the sooner they do that, the more people will feel comfortable about it.
Yeah.
I think Americans are probably feeling uncomfortable knowing whether any of their state senators or state governors have been involved with Epstein. They don't want to know, but there are obviously some people are down on the list that the Department of Justice is keeping under wraps.
Yeah. I mean, you've spoken, and also Di Davies, the former head of Royal Protection, have both spoken pretty openly about what level at which knowledge of certainly Prince Andrew's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and what level that would have gone up to in the palace, whether it's palace staff or indeed senior royals, senior police. In terms of as you say, you think that actually the royals, certainly the king, has done as much as he can to try and distance the royal family from this. At the end of the day, the man, Andrew is his brother, he's the late Queen's son. Do you think that this will end up doing damage irrevocably to the royal family, or there's a contrast in the way he has handled this and the way, for instance, that Keir Starmer has handled this in relation to Mandelson, that actually the king is coming out with quite a lot of credit?
He is coming out with a lot of credit, and you talk about damage. It would be damage to the family. We're talking about two things here.
Yeah.
We're talking about the family. We're talking about the institution of monarchy. The family will feel let down badly. The monarchy will survive. It'll survive in another form in years to come. We'll see Prince William eventually take over. He'll have a different way of approaching things. But at the moment, as you rightly say, the king has done all he can do while it is an ongoing police investigation. But the family themselves are probably smarting over this whole sorry episode, not really knowing what was going on, and the whole thing's dropped on them like a bombshell.
Yeah, again, my question is, how much did people know what was going on? But I imagine, though, that King Charles, when he was Prince of Wales, wasn't able to get as much action as he wanted done on this issue. I think he had a funny feeling he had a very good idea what Prince Andrew was up to. There he is, denied any wrongdoing, but there we are. Badenoch, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. I must ask you first the question I'm putting to our audience today, with Donald Trump criticising Keir Starmer, he says, for terrible leadership. Is that a fair characterisation of our Prime Minister?
So, Julia, you will know that I am Keir Starmer's biggest critic. I think that he is very weak. He doesn't have a plan. He's a hostage to his backbenchers. However, I do disagree with the way that Donald Trump is dealing with Keir Starmer. I think this war of words is very childish. This is the kind of stuff that should be said behind closed doors if he's really unhappy, because we're sending the wrong signal to our opponents like Iran, like Russia. We've got President Zelensky in the UK today. Having the Western alliance in a spat is not what we need to see. But as I said, I am Keir Starmer's biggest critic, but what we want to see in our leaders is dignity. The relationship is not between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. It is between the United Kingdom and the United States. It is a special relationship. It is long-standing. I cannot tell your listeners and your viewers just how much we rely on the US for our security, for our defence. There's a lot that I saw in government, a lot that people don't know. We've got to maintain that relationship for the UK, for NATO, and, to be honest, for stability on the world stage.
Well, indeed, I mean, you've made clear you disagree with Keir Starmer's decision not to allow the US to use the Diego Garcia base for those initial missile attacks on Iran. But is there an argument that, well, we can say, well, you know, Donald Trump said, you know, Europe's our problem. Well, fine, we'll deal with Europe, but this is your problem, Donald Trump. At the end of the day, we don't have the wherewithal, thanks to the hollowing out of our defences over many years, to defend our allies, or indeed our own interests abroad or at home. And we do rely on that security umbrella, not just from NATO, but specifically from the United States. And actually, playing a long game, it would have been wiser to offer that support to Donald Trump, such as we have the military wherewithal to do it. Would that have been a long-term strategic game that you would have played?
Well, I think that what you've touched on is the lack of planning from Keir Starmer. I knew that something was going to happen to Iran because I could see it right back in January when everyone was talking about Greenland. I don't know if you remember, I had this interview with Laura Kuenssberg and I said Greenland is a second-order issue. We need to be looking at Iran. Even online, people were seeing ships mobilizing, going to the Middle East. Keir Starmer was asleep at the wheel. You know, we have not been spending enough on defense. Since 1989, defense spending has come down. It only went up in 2022 under Boris Johnson with Ben Wallace as defense secretary. I remember him saying, we need to start thinking about what's going on in Ukraine. We were thinking ahead. We were able to send tanks, to send, munitions to Ukraine. We helped them. We helped them because we could see it coming. Keir Starmer didn't see anything coming, so he's been caught, you know, fast asleep, doesn't know what he wants to do, doesn't have any meaningful foreign policy that we can point to about what it is he's trying to achieve. My view is that we've got to be acting in the national interest, and that means thinking ahead. But he was completely unprepared, and worst of all, this happened just after that Gorton by-election. He is a hostage to his backbenchers. He's worried about the hard left and the Green Party, and, you know, the people who think that we should be spending more time talking about Gaza than what's going on in our country, and that's why he's in this mess.
Do you think we should be rationing petrol and diesel at this time because of concerns about the Strait of Hormuz not being open? A huge amount of our oil supplies coming from that region?
We need to start drilling our own oil and gas in the North Sea, Julia. We have got oil in this country, and we're not drilling it enough because of Ed Miliband's crazy net zero plans. I think even the renewables industry is saying that we need to start getting stuff out of the North Sea. Instead, we're importing from other countries. This is part of the problem, short-term thinking. And then on top of that, Labour are planning to increase fuel duty. We froze it for 14 years. In fact, we even cut it. They want to add 5p on. They are not thinking seriously. This is yet another burden that households and businesses do not need.
OK, I know we've not got much time with you. I just want to ask you finally, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, got a big speech tonight. Apparently she's going to be setting out her vision. Wasn't aware she had a vision. That'll be interesting to hear. However, she's going to say we need closer ties to the EU if we are to start growing again after a long period of basically pretty much no growth whatsoever, very anemic growth when we have had it. Is the answer to closer ties to the EU?
Well, do we even know what she means by that? The EU also has anemic growth. That was one of the reasons why we left. We need to seize the opportunities of being out of the EU. Clearly, all we can see from Labour is going backwards. Of course, we want closer ties with many countries around the world, yes, including those in the EU, but that means also strengthening ourselves. What she's really saying is a slogan, it is not a plan. Closer ties with the EU that has similar problems to us is not going to solve an ageing population, for example. It is not going to solve so many of the things which we are dealing with. I want to see us competing with the EU while being friends with them. They are our allies. We need to work with them, but it sounds to me like Rachel Reeves wants to go back into the EU because she hasn't got any idea what to do with the UK economy. She doesn't know how to get growth. Every single thing she has done in her budget has made life worse for people. She has ruined a lot of businesses. There's some pubs that won't even let her in, hairdressers that won't let her in. She doesn't know what to do, so she's now talking about the EU because she's hoping to refight wars that finished a long time ago. Let's work with the EU, but quite frankly, she needs to start at home fixing the problems we've got here, and let's start by cancelling that stupid fuel duty rise which she's planning to impose on everybody.
I'm just going to be really naughty and ask you one more question. Are you planning to go to a Gale's Bakery anytime soon?
I have already been to a Gale's bakery. I ordered their food. I think Gale's is a fantastic business. I think it is a disgrace that people are attacking them, this nonsensical intimidation of anything that has to do with Israel and Jewish people in particular. We need to speak out about it, every single one of us who has a voice. We cannot have a situation where people are attacking businesses because they don't like where they think the business is from. We never did that in this country, and it needs to stop. It is not British culture. It is not how we do things here.
Let's talk about what Kemi Badenoch had to say. I mean, again, it's always very difficult. You speak to someone, you're basically an hour after the plan to speak, and she's already spoken to pretty much everybody else. And she's saying a lot of the things, to be fair, she's already said in terms of, criticism of Donald Trump or Keir Starmer. I think she, like a lot of us, feels like, we're big critics of Keir Starmer, but, let's not have the American president slagging him off publicly. And she said this is a war of words and it's childish. That is true. I mean, but to be fair, I hate having to do this. To be fair to the Prime Minister, they're not getting involved in that war of words. I can just imagine David Lammy's going, "Oh, can I? Can I tweet? Can I please?" Stop. This is a. Let's face it. The whole thing with the Iran war and our relations with America, what our involvement is. It's a damage limitation exercise, isn't it? That's all it is.
It is, and I was actually really impressed. All right, this is difficult because the Prime Minister, he has made the right choice in that respect, and it's really difficult for me to say so.
No, but not on Diego Garcia.
No, not on that. But if just slowly not getting involved in a war that isn't ours. I mean, there are a lot of other mistakes. Trust me on that. But I do think that Kemi is right to take a really measured tone, and what's impressed me with her recently is that she's not making knee-jerk reactions to things. Listening to her talking to you, it was all thought through. It is very measured.
I mean, you would say that you're a Tory.
But I've been very, very critical of her. I've been very critical of my entire party over the last 4 years. But I'm starting to see a leader coming through in her, and actually I think her response to this has been impressive.
Okay, I mean, in terms of what if you come the revolution, you and I are in charge. I mean, I would certainly have allowed the use of the Diego Garcia base. This nonsense of it wasn't self-defense. But it is self-defense. Iran has declared war on America. Death to America. Pretty sure that's a declaration of war, and the terror threats, and I consider Israel to be an absolute crucial ally. It's the only democracy in the Middle East, and frankly, I've got very little sympathy for the people fleeing, Dubai and places like that right now, and going, oh no, it's all terrible. Oh, you're not allowed to speak freely about how fearful you are because you get put in prison for 5 years. Oh no, that's because you've been living in a nasty, despotic state where you have no freedoms. You just got the illusion because you get to live in a pretty apartment. I'm sorry, and pay no tax. I've got very little sympathy for those. I want them to be safe, but come back and pay your taxes, and and I mean that to every. I'm sorry, I do feel very strongly about that. Don't expect the British government to help you if you've decided to sod off. And pay taxes. Well, fine, off you go. Fine. Fill your boots, but don't expect us to pick up the pieces when it all goes wrong. That's kind of where I am on that one. But 70% of the British public say they're opposed to us getting involved in this Iran war. But the reality is we are involved. Iran has bombed a military base of ours. Iran does consider us to be, along with Israel, another little Satan. They do consider us to be a part of the problem for them. They would happily blow us up if they could. That's what the Iranian leadership would want to do. They are, basically stopping tankers getting out of the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans, they're self-sufficient in their energy. They don't need oil from the Strait of Hormuz. And by the way, they've got the ability to to get out what they need and or to pay for whatever they need. We don't. We are going to be reliant on that. Let's talk about speed, lower speed limits. As if you, literally, let's just walking speed limit. It's going to go the same as when you had a horse and cart to 100 years ago. Speed limits under emergency plans to cope with the fuel crisis. Rationing of petrol and diesel is a possibility. Who knows what's going to happen? We could have food shortages again because the cost of tankers going around the Horn of Africa, and all of that. There are going to be massive extra impacts, and we saw what happened during lockdown. This could be happening again. We are involved. We will be feeling the impact of this.
But when you actually speak to people and say, do you think that we should be sending troops? Do you think we should be getting more actively involved? And the majority of people now say no. And I think quite a lot of us will remember what happened over Iraq
and
the decisions that were made there based on absolute nonsense.
I'm sorry, again, I mean, I think that dossier was a lie, but at the end of the day,
it was.
We knew that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction because we had sold them to him.
But
he used them against Iran.
But the premise of going to war and suggesting to the public that you had all this dossier of information, which was completely incorrect. I think people remember that. People also remember the 20-odd... lack of planning. The 20-odd years we spent in Afghanistan. For what? Look at what's happened, how many people we lost.
But we're not talking about regime change in Iran. Iraq and Afghanistan are basically backward sort of medieval, certainly Afghanistan, medieval societies. Iran isn't. It's 70% secular. It's a very sophisticated, well-educated and very, would have been otherwise, very wealthy country. There is, we're not talking... Donald Trump's been very clear. It's time for the Iranian people can rise up, but his regime change is not the aim.
So he says, but previously it was the aim. And you sort of think, did he mean regime change or a change in regime, which is what we've ended up with? We've ended up with somebody who is very similar to the previous one, but actually even worse. So this is the younger.
Well, if he's even alive still, or
well, there's no proof to say that he is there? So I think that it was a mess going into it. There were no clear strategies as to why Trump wanted to do this and what he wants to achieve. And I think that is what people are saying, don't get involved.
Well, obviously, last night we had that vote in the Scottish Parliament, which was, many had said was going to be too close to call. In the end, not too close to call at all. A clear vote, 69 to 57, to throw out a bill to allow assisted dying for terminally ill adults. One abstention as well. Many, it seems, who had previously supported the move for assisted dying, then voting against it, given a free vote, as they've had in the House of Commons as well. Why do you think that vote fell when so many thought that was going to go through this time?
I think there were 3 points, basically. The first point was that lots of the MSPs were worried about coercion. And they didn't feel that it was possible to protect against coercion. And as said by a number of them last night, even one case of coercion is one too many. And I think that concern also applies to the Westminster legislation, to be honest. It wasn't just an issue to do with this particular bill. The second issue was that there were powers that had been included in or clauses that had been included in the bill which were actually related to Westminster powers, and so they had to be taken out, particularly in relation to conscience protection for doctors and training. And again, that I think highlighted the fact that the bill had been badly drafted in that sense, or unwisely drafted perhaps.
Rather similar to the Westminster bill, which is also facing difficulties,
And then I think the third thing was that just when people got to the end of the precipice, they just sort of backed off because although lots of people agree in principle, when they think about it in more detail, they change their minds. And I think we saw that with the MSPs as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and particularly the final point. I'm somebody who's long believed we should have assisted suicide for people, not just terminally ill, but people who find their quality of life through disease or disability just unacceptable to them, a life they believe to be not worth living. I consider that to be a fundamental human freedom. But I've been massively opposed to all of these different bills because they don't seem to have the same checks in. So I'm principally in favour and practically against what they've come up with so far. Do you think, though, that inevitably it will happen? We, for many, many years, have had a parliament in Westminster, and I imagine also the same in Scotland, that's actually out of touch with the public view. The public seem to be in favour of bringing in these laws without looking at all the detail that these MSPs have and MPs and Lords in the Houses of Parliament have done in Westminster, that actually this is inevitable. It's happened in American states, it's happened in other European countries and elsewhere, and it's inevitably going to happen here?
I don't think so. Actually, the public just don't want people to suffer. That's the reality of public opinion polls. When you present the arguments against, the public often change their mind and the support drops dramatically, just to 19% in the Scottish context last year in the poll we did.
When you give a specific example.
Yeah, and when you give them the examples of what has happened overseas, particularly people are worried about children, it being extended to children.
Yeah.
That is a big one. People
slope,
feeling
yeah.
That's right.
And we've even had cases, haven't we? 18, 19-year-olds, teenagers in Holland, where who are anorexic and being allowed to die. And there was a big issue, isn't there? People who feel they're a burden on their families. Financially don't have a family, and financially just don't have the support they need to have a decent quality of life, and choosing, in inverted commas, death. And the GPs even under the Westminster law being considered, being able to almost encourage them, offer this as an option to them, whereas people who perhaps have got money and quality of life and a good family would not choose that. And you're then looking at basically, let's kill off the poor and the lonely and the unhappy rather than anyone else, which again makes people very uncomfortable for quite good reasons.
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect too. I mean, you're absolutely right there, but the other aspect is that lots of people who are elderly feel that they are a financial burden on their family just because of the costs of care.
Yeah.
And they want, understandably, they want to pass on their wealth to their children or their grandchildren, and they feel that they should do the decent thing, which is, of course, not the decent thing in a civilized society. But, I think that's an internalized pressure that people feel sometimes, and it's impossible to protect against that, really. And even if the family themselves would be horrified that might be what their relative is thinking, nevertheless, people may feel that pressure.
But what about the people? Again, something I've discussed with my family, discussed with my husband and my child. I've got a relative in a care home, and I look at some of the people in that care home, and I just think that's not a life. I can't imagine a point when I would think that was a life that was worth living for me, and I would want that choice. And I may choose not to take it, but I'd want that choice to be able to opt out of it.
Yeah, but I think you want that choice now when you're fully functioning. But actually, a lot of people who've got dementia are very happy, but it's very difficult for the family. And I think that's what often drives this, is that it's the emotional distress that other members of the family have seeing their relative.
Yeah. Let's turn right now to, we're talking quite a lot about stories related to Islamist influence. We certainly are seeing it, are we not, in our British media in terms of BBC coverage, what happened on October the 7th, the war in Gaza, and I would say also in terms of the coverage of the Iran war as well. We're seeing that conversation we just had and criticism from the Shadow Home Secretary Nick Timothy over the Shadow Justice Secretary. I do apologise, I've misnamed him each time, over this mass prayer event in Trafalgar Square yesterday. And we're also now told it's within the civil service. Who's saying this? Well, it's a former UK ambassador. He says it's undeniable that Islamist entryism is creating anti-Israel sentiment within the civil service. He is a former British diplomat of more than 30 years, Edmund Fitton Brown. I'm delighted to say he joins us right now. A very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you for joining us. What do you mean by Islamist entryism, and how is that impacting I suppose particularly, crucially, our foreign policy?
Well, it's a term that reflects the approach of the strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is about how organised Islamism operates in states where Muslims are in a minority. And that is obviously happening in the United Kingdom, where Muslims are a substantial minority of the population. And the point that I was making was that this has happened throughout society. It's happened in academia, it's happened in school teaching, in all of the professions. And of course, the civil service reflects society, and it's happened also in the civil service. And a lot of it is to do with some of the things that you should or should not talk about. It's affected the field, particularly of counter-terrorism. You'll be familiar with the Shawcross review of the Prevent strategy, where there was, he clearly found that there'd been an attempt to play down the Islamist threat and to play up other terrorist threats or other extremist threats. And what this reflects is a gradual chilling of free expression of concern about these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet shouting, bigot or Islamophobia at people when people are having legitimate, realistic fears about an ideology which was responsible for the vast majority of terror threats and terror deaths in this country. That's not a phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear. This is a very, very sensible, reasonable fear, and it's a fear that is shared in many Muslim countries as well. And your comments, you decided to speak out after the Telegraph revealed that Foreign Office staff had attended an event at the Iranian embassy in London, and it was an event to celebrate the Islamic Revolution. Interesting choice to go there, just weeks after the massacre of tens of thousands of young people on the streets of Iran, and a very senior staff were there. I think people were saying, look, that's part of our job, we have to go to events of regimes we might not approve of, but there was a general view that actually this event was of a different kind. And it was more of it wasn't just a reception that you would attend to keep your contacts. This was almost endorsing this celebration of a regime which has murdered its own citizens, and that was felt to be something that was beyond the pale. It's the fact that perhaps I imagine there was no debate in the Foreign Office about whether or not they should even go to this event.
Well, of course, we don't know what debate there was, but it was absolutely tone deaf to go in the way that they did. I have a long career in diplomacy, and I've been to events hosted by countries that we disagree with. But we have plenty of rules and also precedent for how we gradate that sort of attendance. And with a lot of adversaries, we actually boycott their National Day celebrations. In the case of Iran, the fact that their National Day celebration celebrates the Islamic Republic, which was the beginning of them declaring war on the West, and starting talking about death to America, and then, of course, taking out a contract, hit contract on a British author. Yep. It's extraordinary that we would not always have regarded the Iranians as either to be handled, if you like, to be touched with a very long stick, or not to be touched at all.
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, a lot of the coverage, I think, I've found, frankly, a lot of the BBC, and I would say Sky as well. I don't see so much of ITV, but their coverage of the October the 7th massacre and the subsequent war in Gaza, I found genuinely, utterly shocking and deeply repulsive, frankly, and uninformative, and I mean, I think just blatantly untrue, a lot of it. And then we've also had the coverage of the Iran war, and a lot of talk about how, and we've seen this even in criticism within Trump's own regime in America about, this is the Israeli hand is controlling all of this, seems to be the issue. We've had criticism from John Simpson, the BBC, of the decision to sort of kill this Iranian security chief who basically ordered the murder and the massacres in the streets of ordinary Iranian youngsters protesting for some basic civil rights peacefully in January, and talking about how he was a very clever and very reasonable man. Later deleted it because, he thought it had been misinterpreted. But, of course, it wasn't misinterpreted, was it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't misinterpreted, and there's been a lot of criticism and a lot of inquiries also about the coverage, particularly of the Gaza war. As you say, we're now seeing it with the Iran war as well. But in the case of the Gaza war, the BBC has had to apologise again and again for bias in its coverage. The same is true of the Canadian state broadcaster. You can also say it of a number of other broadcasters. CNN has been pretty bad at times. And one of the interesting things in all of this is these organisations are all on good terms with Al Jazeera, the Qatari state-owned propaganda channel, which of course it has the appearance of being a very sophisticated news channel. It has all of the resources and all of the correspondence, and sometimes it makes reports which are really well researched and well presented, but it systematically pursues an Islamist and pro-Qatari agenda.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the same as Russia Today and people who justify the Jeremy Corbyns and others who've justified appearing on Russia Today. It's like, oh, well, no one interferes at all with anything that I say, and it's perfectly, reasonable commentary and reporting. No, they do that as the cover for everything else they do, and you're basically giving succor to them. Why do you think this has happened, though, in terms of the capture of this sort of Islamist, pro-Islamist ideology effect? This sort of, a lot of this is down to, I think, whether it's in the civil service, in the BBC, the NHS, all the other professions, academia. A lot of this is down to just a general woke agenda, which is there's a hierarchy of power the oppressors and the oppressed, and some point Muslims became the ultimate oppressed people on the planet, along with trans people, interestingly. And at some point Jews went from being the most oppressed to the biggest oppressor. A lot of this, we know, came out of Soviet Union. The issue of the Jews in Israel, a lot of this was Soviet Union propaganda for many, many years. But how did this become so endemic in pretty much every profession, every quango, every organisation, the heart of our government, our academia? How did that happen?
I think it was just, it was really a misunderstanding, I think, of minorities. You know, you have minorities, a number of minorities in the United Kingdom. You've got Hindu minority, a Sikh minority, and many, many others. And in some way, the Muslim community has been patronized. It's been treated as something different. And I sometimes think that some of the worst of this is really the way that it's actually affecting Muslims. Yeah. If you talk about Islamophobia, you mentioned this sort of this extraordinary misstep that the government is making in sort of codifying Muslims as being a community uniquely in need of coddling and protection. Yeah. But who is it they're protecting? The people they're protecting are actually the self-appointed community leaders who bully ordinary Muslims. And if you're a young Muslim girl in Britain who aspires to be free and successful, and the British government is actually making apologies for a patriarchy that keeps you down, it's is extraordinary. So you get completely inverted priorities. And you talked about the sort of hierarchy of oppression stuff. That is, again, absolutely crazy stuff. So if you're part of the Jewish community, and here we have a real problem with anti-Semitism, which has shown itself to be rife in the Western world, and Jews just can't win because they're supposed to be colonialists and oppressors, and they're sort of regarded as white oppressors. And I think that in this respect, that what we're doing is we're sort of displacing our own colonial guilt. So if we feel bad about sort of something that we perhaps did in our imperial days, 70 years ago, we now are trying to hold Israel responsible for that.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre, isn't it? Just finally, briefly, if you would, Edmund Fisher-Brown, you're speaking out, and my goodness, we appreciate that you have. Are you a lone voice? Are you just one of very, very few, perhaps, in the civil service who are concerned about this, or do you think that actually there are many more like you, like there may be, in every organisation, in academia, or even at the BBC, where people are just too afraid to speak out?
No, I know for a fact that there are many, many more like me, including those who are still in the civil service, including people I know in the BBC, including people I know in academia. Of course, the problem here is, I have the luxury of speaking out because I'm no longer a civil servant. I'm no longer subject to government discipline. And I'm, again, I have a think tank career now in which I can speak my mind without fear of consequences. But what I have seen very clearly, both in the civil service and in a whole range of professions, is people who think this way but are afraid to say it because it's career death to be accused of Islamophobia.
Let's talk more about that meningitis outbreak. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, has said that he is worried, he said, about this meningitis outbreak. We've now got the number of confirmed cases up from 15 to 20. It's been confirmed by the UK Health Security Agency this morning. 2 young people, a sixth form pupil and a student at the University of Kent, have died as a result of the outbreak. We've got a case in London now, so it spread from Kent to London. We know one case was identified in France as well from an exchange student. We've also got a 9-year-old baby among those in hospital as well. I mean, a 9-month-old. Absolutely terrifying. Let's talk about this with Dr. Lawrence Buttman. He's a GP, former chair of the BMA GPs Committee. Good morning to you, Lawrence.
Morning.
This reminds me of those days every morning when we used to speak and discuss what was going on with COVID. Look, we see a load of people with masks, so it must be serious, even though it's not an airborne disease, which may be a bit confused. But how worried should young people be? How worried should parents be for their young children, or indeed their children at sixth form or university?
If you get meningitis, you should be extremely worried. Otherwise, you don't need to worry terribly much because your risk of catching it is quite small if you're not in close proximity to people who are carrying meningitis.
And what does close proximity mean?
Next to or very close to and breathed over.
Breathed over. Okay, so it is airborne, but we've been told it's if That's right. Students pass it on. They're all snogging. They're sharing drinks. They're sharing vapes.
Right. It's only if you're very close or kissing or sharing vapes. You wouldn't get it crossing the other side of the street. You're not going to get it walking along the street. You won't catch it like that.
You're going to get it sitting next to someone on the bus?
Almost certainly not, unless you're remarkably friendly.
Okay, right. Yeah, I'm not that friendly with people on the train. Okay. But, I mean, we know that if you do get it, it is very, very serious. And one of the issues we've had is people simply not realising, because we all know about meningitis and the rash. And again, that's when my daughter had a scare. That was first alerted us, and she didn't have it in the end. But you have a rash, you put the glass on it, you press down, and if the rash disappears, it's probably fine. If the rash doesn't go, that is a get straight to hospital moment, isn't it?
Yes, but I wouldn't wait for the rash.
That's the crucial bit, yeah.
Is a late sign and really is not much use. Clearly, if you have a non-blanching rash, a rash that doesn't change when you put a glass on top of it, that clearly is an emergency and you should go straight to hospital.
Yeah.
Make sure when you get to hospital, they know that you might have meningitis, so they don't put you in the waiting room with everybody else.
No, indeed. But the key things to look out for, we're told, just simply feeling unwell, a bad headache, a stiff neck. Those are much more the early signs. But again, one of the worries, of course, especially with the student population, after apparently going to this chemistry nightclub on 3 different nights in early March, is that one of the symptoms could be confused with a hangover. So easy for those early symptoms to have been missed.
Remarkable tiredness, drowsiness, feeling that your head hurts badly, but also it hurts all over, and you can't look at light.
Light is part of it, okay.
Stiff neck, and very often the stiff neck is the first thing.
Right. But that's the key thing, is identifying it early. And what do you make of the UK HSA, the Health Security Agency, by all accounts on Friday identifying there might be a cluster of cases, contacting doctors but not telling the public, no effort to contact students until Sunday evening, so well after the weekend's festivities and snogging and vape sharing and drink sharing, but also when they did contact the chemistry nightclub, which they think was, the basically ground zero of this outbreak, they contacted them by, an unverified social media handle, as opposed to going there, finding the owners and seeing if they could track people down. That seems to me to be a pretty basic failure of the Health Security Agency, isn't it?
Yes, well, I'm not going to defend them, only to say that what happened in this weekend is what would normally happen in a meningitis outbreak. It's not enough for various other illnesses, but meningitis tends to spread quite slowly.
Yeah.
In that you've got time. It's not like COVID when you can infect an entire room with one cough. It's not like that.
Right. And it can be a 2-week incubation period. So a lot of these students, they may have got infected or affected someone else, not realise. Because presumably there are people who, I know 10% of people carry the meningitis virus, bacteria in them, 20% or something in younger people. They could have caught it and not had any symptoms?
Yes.
And then spread it elsewhere.
It's very easy to catch it, have no symptoms whatsoever, although it could be found on a throat swab, and then to give it to somebody else whose immunity is not quite as good, and then those people can go from just having it in their throat where it does no harm at all to getting it in their bloodstream when it's extremely dangerous.
Right. So University of Kent closed down exams, closed down all the social events, social student union. All the students who are heading off in a couple of weeks for Easter holidays, they've left early, having possibly taken the infection back. We've now got an infection in London. I mean, again, this is now a national incident. I mean, it seems to me that everything that should have happened it has been the wrong thing to have happened, surely.
I would have said things have been rather slow.
You're being generous.
Not that they haven't been done properly, but everything's been a little bit too slow. And I suppose because if there's only 1 or 2 cases, you don't get the breeze up you quite as much as if there are 20 cases where it's now a big deal.
Yeah.
Clearly, there will be other cases. Yeah. I'd be amazed if it's limited to this.
Well, those are the ones who are in hospital that have been identified, and no one else would have had the testing. But again, don't you act when there's 2 cases so you don't end up with 20?
Well, you would have thought so. I think that it might have been a quick move to give out the preventative antibiotics rather quicker, because whenever I've been in a situation where I've diagnosed meningitis, everyone who's been anywhere near the patient has been taking the preventing antibiotics immediately.
Yeah.
You don't want to wait and see whether you're going to be the unlucky one.
Yeah.
See.
And again, because at the end of the day, and again, unlike COVID, this for young people is a deadly disease, and it does have, and people losing limbs. I mean, those of us who've met people who've gone through this is a horrific disease. Take it seriously. If in doubt, get to the doctor. Be very clear about what you believe. You believe it's meningitis.
Afternoon, Julia. You're good.
I'm very well. I'm obviously a lot better than 4 million Brits who are apparently on disability handouts. This figure, every time, we talk about this regularly on the show. These figures keep coming out, but the numbers are just rising exponentially. Britain's benefits bill spiralling out of control. Tell us something we don't know. 4 million people now. It's a record-breaking number of people now claiming the main disability payout. This is PIP, Personal Independence Payments, and they've doubled in just the last 7 years. Now, has there been something in the water? Is this all COVID related? What has suddenly happened that we are suddenly a massively disabled, let's face it, a lot of this is mental health, population?
Yeah, well, I don't think you can say that we've seen a doubling in the number of disabled people in the population in the last 7 years, Julia. And I think the IFS did some analysis on this as well, looking at the UK and disability-related benefits compared to some other comparable countries, and they didn't see the same increase. So you can't really put this down to say the cost of living, the pandemic. Other countries have seen significant impact of this. There's got to be something fundamental that's going on in the UK. And you're right, so just over 2 million people in 2019, up to around 4 million people now. And it's a staggering cost. It's forecasting. It's about 29 billion now, going to continue to grow. By the end of the part, 2030, 31, could be 41 billion.
Yeah, I mean, these numbers are huge. Yeah. And the key thing here is these people aren't just on this year's bill. Realistically, statistically, once you're on a lot of these benefits, you're on them for life. And not only are you getting benefits, you are not working and paying tax and making your contribution. So you're not even contributing it towards, at some point, your own pension. Like, we are looking at decades of extra billions of spending.
And the kind of the important thing on this is increase has been risen by a lot of younger people in the population. So this is a long-term problem. And I was looking at the data. When they do these reassessments, around 9 in 10 continue to receive the benefits. Yeah. So we need to look at that. There's certain things we need to identify. We want to support people who are genuinely ill. That's the first thing we want to do. But we have to draw some lines here. This isn't the benefit system was a safety net, not a lifestyle. And that's where we've currently got into.
And a lot of the people who talk about this, commentate on this, the hand-wringers, are you accusing people of lying? No one would choose to be on these benefits. These people, and they're always told the vast majority of these people want to work. Well, they want to have a job that pays 60 grand involving eating chocolate all day. Unfortunately, that job's not available to them because they may not have any qualifications. I don't think that job does exist. If it does, I would love that job, please. But the reality is that, people aren't willing to do the work that is available to them at the qualification level they've got and the skills level they've got. And so they go, do you know what? I'd rather live on benefits for, frankly, as it is often, if you're on PIP, roughly the same amount of money I'd get on benefits, and no one bothers me every day, and I don't have to get up in the morning, don't have to pay transport, don't have to have office outfits, take my lunch. A lot of people are quids in on these benefits.
No, totally, Julia. And there are some people where the government-owned policies will be impacted on it. So I can imagine if you're a young person, mental health and psychiatric disorders is a key driver of this, Julia. And what we've seen 85,000 payroll jobs gone for the under 25. So the government's own tax policies have been harming jobs for younger people. And that might have that thing where, what am I going to do in life? I can't get a job. I can't at university. I'm struggling to get a job. So you've got to look at the root causes of this. But there's no way that we've seen this massive increase underlying. This is basically, there's not something suddenly happening in the population. This is basically the government being softer in terms of dishing out the benefits.
Yeah, and again, people being interviewed on Zoom, people being able to, use AI or use just Google or just some of these TikTok accounts to say, well, what do I need to say? Oh, I've got depression, I've got anxiety. Yes, I have considered suicide. Tick, tick, tick. There you go. You're on benefits for life. And the thing is, it's not just cruel to taxpayers who are having to work harder and longer to pay not just their own bills, but the bills for these people. It's also cruel on particularly the young people, or even people in their 50s. Now, I'm in my 50s. You're getting left on the scrap heap in your 50s, but you're on the scrap heap at 18 or 24. That's it. That's game over.
No, totally. And the best route to kind of prosperity is work, and that's the critical thing. And
to longer living, better health, better happiness. Work is good for you.
Yeah, totally. And that's what I think the government have talked about this week, creating youth jobs and more taxpayers' money to do that. I'd always say it's easy not to actually lose the jobs in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Can I just say, though, there is one person I would like to be out of a job, and that's Rachel Reeves, Rachel from Accounts, whose abacus is clearly broken again. She gave a big speech yesterday afternoon, and she's. I mean, we know that Keir Starmer and her both want to reverse Brexit. Of course they do. They're massive Ramonas. But she called for the UK to start following huge swathes of Brussels rules again. She also claimed that our GDP, our economic output, had been hit to the tune of 8% in the years since we Brexited. I mean, this is just a laughable figure. We'd be going along. I mean, steaming along like the American and the Canadian economies, as opposed to like France and Germany's, if we had Brexited. I mean, what evidence does she have for that absurd claim?
Yeah, you can do any modelling and come up with any evidence you want, Julie. Again, this is absolute absurd. This is a distraction. This is basically what we've had in the last 2 quarters of last year. 2 quarters of negative growth per head. When you look at that, which technically we're in a recession when you look on a per head basis, it's a distraction. They blame Brexit. She will blame Brexit for the decisions that she's caused. Ultimately, she keeps coming out every time saying we're on the right economic plan, but high taxes, we've got job losses. State spending is masking the private sector decline that we see in Julia. And you're right, France and Germany aren't exactly booming along, not at all. The US are doing really well, but to blame this on Brexit is, again, just a distraction.
Every single thing, people say, Brexit's not going very well. You sort of go, well, yeah, I mean, I think we just have the small matter of lockdown and Ukraine war. I think they might have been more relevant to most people's lives and to the economy. And we have no money left and everyone's on benefits. I think that might have had more to do with it, which of course has been known to spread to London. It's now affecting, we know, 2 different universities. It's spread to a second university in Kent. And we also know now that we are looking at 27 suspected cases rather than, it was 15 at the beginning of yesterday, then it rose to 20. And of course, we know also a 9-month-old baby is among those who's very sick in hospital. Let's talk to Soren Gouvard, who's a pharmacist and healthcare expert. A very good morning to you, Soren.
Good morning. Always lovely to join you. Sad to be about this matter,
we rarely get to talk to you about something fun, do we? It's nearly always something negative. Look, this meningitis outbreak is already claimed 2 lives, a 6th former and a student. I mean, very, very young lives, very, very gory. It's spread now to Canterbury Christchurch University as well. But we know that the epicentre, ground zero, really, was this chemistry nightclub. And early, the first week of March, 3 nights when patients seem to have been at this club in Canterbury, 5th, 6th and 7th of March, including a French exchange student and 6th formers as well. First of all, how is this disease spreading? And what does it tell us if the cases are rising now about the risks?
Okay, this is an unprecedented situation, and I don't use those words that often, but we don't have, this is bacterial meningitis, and it's rarer than viral meningitis, but when we do come across it, it does tend to be a worse situation. The situation at the moment is that overall, to people who have been outside that Kent area and who haven't been close contacts of those individuals, the overall risk remains low. But for those people who are in those areas, so in this nightclub, we know that we know how this is spread, bacterial meningitis B. It's shared by saliva, it's that sharing cups, utensils, lipsticks, a bit of snogging, and also coughing, sneezing. It's close contact. So what has now happened is the close contact, so people who live with people who were there, are then being offered prophylactic antibiotics, and that is essentially just to manage, to sort of get ahead of the situation. And that will actually, if that's for people who may already have come into contact. We know we saw those lines of students, where most students, by all accounts, at Kent University have now gone home because Easter break, there's no parties at the Students' Union, and there are no exams, so they've all gone home. But those antibiotics, people who've been to that club, been in close contact with someone who's been to the club, and that will actually prevent them from getting ill. So if we think about how this bacteria is spread, most of us have, some of us have this in our throats, and it's doing nothing. It's not causing an illness to us. In some people, that the levels of that bacteria will increase to levels where it causes a problem and starts to cause symptoms of things like fits, so seizures, high temperature, a rash which does not, it doesn't, you can still can't be seen after when you put a glass on it. So, but the problem
it can be. See, that's we had to look that up twice yesterday. So if you put the glass on it and the rash goes away, that's not meningitis. If you put a glass on it, press down, and it does stay there still. But as we know, the rash is often quite late on. It's the head, the headache, feeling ill, the headache, the stiff neck. Those are often the earlier signs.
Yes, but the problem is sometimes people don't get those symptoms. Yeah. So you may have what you think are hangover symptoms, but they could be meningitis symptoms. Yeah. And if you've been to a club, you may have been drinking.
Well, exactly.
So it's more about encouraging people to watch out for their friends and friends and colleagues. And in a university setting, you're away from home. You might not have someone checking in on you as often as your mum knocking on the door to check you're up after that hangover the next morning.
Yeah.
So making sure that we're looking after our people around us and watching out. I think vigilance for me is.
That's the key. Do you think the UK Health Security Agency were a bit remiss? I mean, we can all be supportive of these people, but on Friday they found out there might be an outbreak. Yeah, look, it's not like we never have any cases of meningitis. We have cases, and sadly people do still die. It's massively gone down since we've had vaccinations, certainly for the viral meningitis. But there are still cases. But they didn't notify people at the university until Sunday. They only contacted the club via social media on Instagram rather than actually calling them up and going to the. They could have got on top of this a bit sooner, couldn't they?
Getting on top of this as quick as possible is always going to be the best thing to do. What I would say is I thought it was pretty clever that they contacted the club via social media, actually, because as well as I do, you call up these places, bars, you can't get hold of anyone. Yeah. So the fact that they went through that step is a positive thing. But the focus now is on getting hold of the contacts of people. And we're going to talk about vaccination here, but this vaccination for meningitis B hasn't been rolled out for these students, so a lot of these students won't have had meningitis.
Kids who basically it's been rolled out, so 12-year-olds will be having it. So the next generation going to university will, but not the kids this age at uni.
Exactly, because it was 2015 that this started to be rolled out, the meningitis B, but there is a different vaccine for meningitis, which has been being given to freshers and students before they went to university. The problem is doesn't cover the meningitis B strain, basically.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of people getting hold of jabs, a lot of people say, well, I haven't got a kid at Kent University, but it's spread to London, my kid's in London, or it's spread to Manchester, or my kid's in Manchester, or whatever. People being concerned, can they get hold of this jab? Because there's been some accusations that pharmacies are hiking up the price, and 200 quid is the price.
Well, number one, not all pharmacies provide this. It's not an NHS service for this to be provided by pharmacies. Two, a lot of pharmacies won't have the stock in the first place because it's not a routine item that we're providing. And I think unless you're in Kent or close to this, I don't think people should be trying to access this vaccine right now. We need to focus the supply on those who really need it, which is in this area.
Very good point. Thorin Govin, a pharmacist and healthcare expert. Thank you very much indeed for that. Philip Ingram, this is the thing. Be wary, be aware, be vigilant, but let's not all go into mad, crazy health panic and putting on masks and the nonsense.
Well, the masks help because coughing and sneezing is a direct way of this being spread, and the
masks don't.
No, well, and they stop people from vaping as well, and therefore sharing their vapes. And in this occasion, it is very good, and the bacteria is much larger than the virus.
Yeah,
so it does help.
That's a fair point.
And you also have to recognise meningococcal B. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 carry it.
Just first of all, what do you make of Donald Trump's threat to massively blow up the oil fields which owned by Iran in the Gulf? This after Israel attacked Iranian half of this Gulf field, and then Iran basically retaliated against Qatar. What do you make of the Trump allegation claim that, well, he's going to, there will be a retaliation again if there's another attack on Qatar in terms of the attack on the Iranian Gulf gas field, but also they claimed that the Americans had no idea that Israel was going to attack.
Well, there do seem to be quite a lot of decisions, Julia, being made off the hoof at the moment by President Trump. And as you say, it would appear that the Israelis might be doing things in isolation, which is creating problems, even more problems we've got at the moment. And the threat to blow up this massive gas field, I assume President Trump believes that that will be the sort of straw that breaks the Iranian camel's back, but also it could have a really profound effect. And it all, I think, goes to the point of what everybody's discussing at the moment, the Strait of Hormuz, and the fact that it's shut, and the fact that all of us who've been looking at this for ages sort of realised that that was always going to be the Achilles heel. And now Trump is trying to open it again when you would have thought they'd have a load of plans in place because it was so obvious that's what the Iranians
this is the thing. I mean, I'm no strategic expert, but I no military knowledge whatsoever. But yet it seems really obvious, just the basic geography. And we know it's not like it's a tactic that Iran hasn't used before many a time because they know they've got that power. Isn't this part of the issue with wars these days at all? Which is that it's same with Israel and Hamas. Israel was fighting a military war. Hamas was fighting a PR war, social media, fighting a war back home in America and Europe to get, recognition for a Palestinian state and the like, and condemnation of Israel. And ultimately, they're hoping a lack of military and financial support from countries like America, which is an important military ally. But at the same time, we've got Iran, again, fighting with America. But Iran is fighting an economic battle. Whereas Israel and America are fighting a military battle. If you're fighting two different wars, how do you know who's won?
Well, you're absolutely right. What we're seeing is basically the Americans and the Israelis are fighting a symmetric war, if you like, and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranians are fighting an asymmetric war because they can't compete conventionally with Israel and the US. So the Straits of Hormuz, that's asymmetry at absolute best. They're doing one thing that is really paralysing an awful lot of what the US is trying to achieve. So therein always the challenge, and that is always going to be the case. So the US needs to come up with ways to nullify this. And I think, as you mentioned, it's nothing new. The Strait of Hormuz being used by Iran. They've used it many times in the past. The West has succeeded, and I do take a bit of hope. People might not remember the Iran-Iraq war back in the late 80s, but in those days, British and American special forces secured the Straits of Hormuz, which allowed Western shipping to go in and out during the Iran-Iraq war. And I think rather than putting loads of ships and Royal Naval ships that we don't actually have, I hope the Americans are looking at something more like Operation Prime Chance back in the 80s, using special forces rather than trying to bludgeon through with capital ships.
Of course, this was, of course, all before drone warfare, which has been an absolute game changer, has it not? It's interesting. My guest in the studio today is Philip Ingram, former senior military intelligence officer. I'm sure you all know each other.
We're old friends and colleagues.
You're always old friends. And he's of the view that there's no way in the world that the US didn't know that Israel was going to strike this Iranian gas field. But also that there has been, British involvement in a lot of the planning and all of this. And we're talking, Keir Starmer was talking a good game about us not being involved, but we actually are very much involved. How should we be more involved? Should we have, often the use of the Diego Garcia base to the Americans right from the start? Should we have been supporting the US, or is this very much, an Israeli and US war and nothing to do with us? What would you say to that?
Well, I'm afraid it is everything to do with us, but it is certainly not a NATO operation. This, as you say, this is an Israeli and US one. But we, of course, are involved. There are hundreds of thousands of Brits and in the Middle East who need to be protected. And as we're seeing now, you just look at your local petrol station, the price of petrol's gone up by 20 or 30%. So, of course, it involves us. And anything we can do to stop that, we should be doing. But, I'm sure, as Phil has discussed, that there is not a lot of British hard military capability that we can supply. But, when it comes to planning, and Philip was a strategic planner and I wasn't, so he can probably better comment, that's exactly where we can help. And also our beleaguered special forces, the irony should not be lost on anybody, that this is actually Starmer's get out of jail card, his ace card, and potentially he's going to ask those very people who he's allowing to be run through the human rights courts for stuff that they've done allegedly done in Iraq and Afghanistan and Northern Ireland, where it's actually that they have been keeping us safe in our beds for a decade.
And our special forces are renowned around the world, and highly rated as among the very, very best in the world. In terms of where this all ends, such as anyone knows, people say, well, maybe just for a few days. I worry sometimes that Donald Trump thought he was going to have another Venezuela, and this would be just in a few days. Iranian regime collapses, the people take over, democracy, kumbaya, kumbaya. Doesn't look anything like that. Any of that is happening. Or are we being, and it was something that Philip Ingram pointed out earlier, thinking this is like a video game and people just expecting war to be quick, to be clean, no civilian deaths, and the weeping and wailing of gnashing of teeth of our very liberal media. Sort of, Sky have been doing reports all week from inside Iran, talking to people who are at the funeral of one of the tyrants of the Iranian regime, talking to the victims. Of course, a mother whose child has been bombed in the war is going to be horrified. But I don't think we had those sort of reports from Germany during the Second World War. Are we at the point where the West, we just sort of can't fight a war because our expectations are just completely unrealistic now?
Well, you make a lot of very good points there, absolutely. And you kind of get the feeling that Trump and some of his close advisors who are not very experienced and not very worldly in these sort of geostrategic conflicts seem to think that it'll be over in 24 hours. That just doesn't happen. You just look at Ukraine. The casualty rates in Ukraine are the same as the First World War 110 years ago. So it is hugely complex. And people want instant gratification. Unfortunately, that is just not going to happen. However, I think Trump's buoyed on by what he did with Venezuela and Maduro. He anticipated doing the same in Iran, but that is not the case. And of course, while everybody's looking at the Middle East, Putin is quietly cracking on in Ukraine. And the final bit here, Julia, whatever happens in Ukraine and Europe has far more relevance to the security of this country, quite frankly, than what's happening in the Middle East.
And you're someone who's obviously, been in military action in the Middle East, and I know you were very involved, in Syria and trying to sort of help people there, civilians there. Is this the thing that actually is Europe right to say, well, Donald Trump, you told us, Europe's your problem. You deal with Europe. You deal with Ukraine. That's for you. Are they right now to say, fine, then we will, and we will concentrate our resources and our expertise and our military might and finances in trying to save Ukraine, rather than being involved militarily, if not the planning and the like, in what's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. But like the UK, there are, the Germans and others have a lot of people in the Middle East who need to be protected.
Yeah.
So, I believe our focus should be very much in creating, a ceasefire and a just peace for Ukraine and Europe, and making sure that Putin, the great tyrant who's still, unfettered by the Americans, doesn't expand further westwards.